Picture the most extravagant throne room ever built by human hands, and now fill it with the stench of iron and burning resin. Beyond doors layered in hammered gold, sounds no palace should ever produce leak through heavy drapes. The kind of sounds that make palace guards stare at the floor and keep walking. Somewhere inside, animals trained to obey royalty are being rewarded with something that was alive not long ago. This is not some dungeon carved beneath a fortress. This is the private wing of the Achaemenid dynasty, the beating heart of ancient Persia, where the man who called himself King of Kings and the woman who shared his bed treated human beings the way a child treats insects, something to play with, pull apart, and crush when the fun runs out. History remembers Xerxes as a giant who marched against Greece and ruled under the blessing of the gods. That version of the story has been scrubbed clean. What it leaves out is what happened after Greece humiliated him. When his great invasion crumbled and his legend shattered, Xerxes stopped looking outward. He retreated behind the walls of his own palace and built a private universe where no desire was too dark and no request could be refused. Inside that world, women were not people. Servants were not people. They were furniture, they were entertainment, they were disposable. And when his obsession landed on the one target that should have been untouchable, the wife and daughter of his own brother Masistes, Xerxes did not pull back. He tried to bury the scandal under gifts, promises, and silence. But all he really did was hand a loaded weapon to the most dangerous person in the empire, the woman sleeping next to him every night, his queen, Amestris. Persian warlords destroyed their enemies with bronze and fire, with cavalry charges and siege towers. Amestris did not need any of that. Her weapon was terror. She understood something most rulers never figure out. If you truly want to own someone, you do not simply end their life. You dismantle them. You erase their face, their body, their very identity, until the person standing in front of you is unrecognizable even to their own family. What we are about to walk through, moment by moment, is how one queen seized her husband's obsession with his niece Artente and weaponized it into a cascade of violence so extreme that an entire bloodline was erased from history. This is a story of golden halls soaked in blood, of skin treated like fabric to be cut and reshaped, of an empire rotting from the inside because the poison was coming from the throne itself. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you are watching from right now. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe so we can keep pulling these buried histories into the light. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel on the planet. Xerxes came back from Greece like a god who had been punched in the mouth. Just a few seasons earlier, he had lashed the ocean with chains, stitched 2 continents together with floating bridges, and marched more soldiers than most civilizations had ever seen in one place. Then, Salamis happened. 480 BC. His warships splintered. Greek rams tore through Persian hulls while he sat on a golden chair above the waterline and watched his entire mythology sink. The man who left Persia as a living deity returned as something far more dangerous. A humiliated king with unlimited power and nowhere to aim it. On the surface, nothing changed. The treasury still overflowed. Gold still arrived from Egypt. Grain still poured in from Babylon. Governors in distant provinces still knelt when his name was spoken. But inside the palace corridors, the air had shifted. Courtiers who once competed to praise his brilliance now changed the subject when Greece came up. Generals who had promised easy victory suddenly found reasons to stay away from the throne room. Greek diplomats walked through Susa with a confidence that would have been suicidal 2 years earlier. Xerxes could feel the cracks spreading beneath him, but there was nothing left to conquer that would fix what Salamis had broken. So he did what shattered rulers always do. He stopped looking outward and turned his hunger for dominance inward, into the only kingdom he still controlled without question, his own palace. And inside that palace, no one owned their own body. Every servant, every dancer, every eunuch breathed at the king's pleasure. A flick of his wrist could mean a reward, a beating, or a silent disappearance that nobody would ever ask about. The harem operated like a machine built to ensure he never encountered a boundary. Women were selected, groomed, perfumed, and rotated through his chambers like inventory. If he wanted a new face, advisors produced one. If his interest faded, the girl vanished into some forgotten wing of the palace. The unspoken law was absolute. The king's appetite was sacred, and your flesh was just raw material. Now, there was one man who had earned real respect during the disaster in Greece. His name was Masistes, and he was Xerxes' own brother. Masistes had spoken up in war councils when others stayed silent. He had challenged bad strategy. He had tried to keep the campaign grounded when everyone else was too afraid to disagree with a living god. Xerxes dismissed him at the time, but he never forgot. Back in Persia, Masistes held a position of genuine authority. He had rank, respect, and deep roots at court. On the surface, the two brothers coexisted without friction. That would not last. The first fracture appeared at a royal banquet. It was one of those enormous feasts designed to drown the memory of defeat in excess. Tables buried under food, braziers filling the air with imported smoke, musicians playing until their hands cramped. Xerxes reclined on his elevated couch, ringed by nobles and advisors. The women of the royal household occupied a separate area, but at events like this, the barriers thinned. Faces became visible, voices carried. That is when Xerxes noticed her, the wife of Masistes. Herodotus never records her name, and that silence tells you everything about what she meant to the men writing history. An unnamed woman at the center of a catastrophe. She did not stand out because of jewels or exposed skin. What separated her from every other person in that hall was something far more unsettling to a man like Xerxes: composure. She moved through a court built on performance and terror, with a stillness that looked almost defiant. She did not flinch when the king's gaze passed over her. She did not lower her eyes on reflex. In a room full of people rehearsing submission to survive, she looked like someone who still belonged to herself. For Xerxes, that was intolerable. He had grown used to watching people collapse under his attention. Basic human dignity, in a woman no less, registered in his brain as a challenge. Desire curdled into fixation almost instantly. He did not just want her body. He wanted to prove that nothing in his empire existed beyond his reach. He whispered to a trusted eunuch. He sent elaborate gifts. He arranged private encounters disguised as family courtesies. She turned him down. Not once. Not with a soft deflection that left the door open. She rejected him completely and without apology. She was married to his brother. She would not become his secret. No treasure, no title, no veiled threat could move her. In any normal court, refusing a powerful man carried risk. In the court of a king who claimed to rule by the authority of Ahura Mazda himself, it was almost a death sentence. People had been destroyed for far smaller acts of defiance. But Xerxes hesitated. He could have forced the issue. No guard would have intervened. No court would have held him accountable. But he understood the mathematics. Masistes was not some disposable courtier. He was blood. He was powerful. Humiliating him publicly by taking his wife could ignite the kind of rebellion that a post-Salamis empire could not survive. The Persian ruling class was already whispering about weakness. Cracking the last pillar of family loyalty could bring the entire structure down. So Xerxes pulled back from the mother, and his gaze slid down one generation to the daughter. Her name was Artente, younger, less hardened, raised inside a world where the king's attention was the most powerful currency that existed. A single gesture from the throne could elevate a nobody into someone who mattered overnight. She was Masistes' daughter, and that bloodline made her both shielded and vulnerable. The same family ties that protected her father now made her useful to Xerxes in a completely different way. Touching the wife would light a fuse, but the daughter, that boundary was still dangerous, still forbidden, but far easier to disguise behind generosity and polite fictions. He moved in slowly. Jewelry first, fine fabrics, invitations to private gatherings framed as family honors. He played the role of a doting uncle. Then, inch by inch, he erased that line. Every gift carried more pressure. Every kind word landed with the full weight of the throne behind it. At first, she may have believed it was harmless, but refusing the King of Kings was not a simple choice. Saying no did not just endanger her, it endangered her father, her mother, her entire household. In a palace like this, the concept of free choice did not exist. Power was the only language. Under that crushing weight, Artente became his lover. What began as a grotesque submission to royal obsession hardened into an ongoing affair. For Xerxes, it was medicine, a way to feel dominant again after Greece had stripped that feeling away. For Artente, it was a cage that looked like a gift. For Masistes' wife, the woman who had refused the king and kept her dignity, it was a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding inside her own family. And Queen Amestris saw everything. She occupied the highest seat any woman in the empire could hold. Official queen, daughter of Otanes, bound to the king by marriage and political architecture. It is easy to reduce her to a simple villain. But look at where she stood. Her position was enormous and precarious at the same time. She was surrounded on every side by rivals, concubines angling for influence, foreign princesses sent as political gifts, younger women paraded through the court like auditions. If she showed a single crack, her sons could lose their place in the succession. Her survival depended on reading every signal the palace produced, and the palace produced plenty. Servants whispered. Eunuchs traded secrets in half-sentences. Guards tracked who entered which room and at what hour. Amestris missed nothing. She noticed unfamiliar jewelry appearing on Artente. She watched the girl's posture change in public. A new confidence, a smile that lingered too long, the unmistakable air of someone who believed she held a secret advantage. In a court where a single glance could shift the balance of power, these were not small details. They were evidence. Inside Amestris' mind, a narrative crystallized. She became convinced that Masistes' wife, the composed, dignified woman who had always commanded respect, had deliberately placed her own daughter in the king's bed. Not out of desperation. As a calculated strike, by giving Xerxes access to Artente, this woman could weaken the queen's position, humiliate her publicly, and pull her family closer to the center of power. That was the story Amestris chose to believe. Whether it was fair or accurate did not matter. Once she accepted that version, her target was locked. Meanwhile, Xerxes sank deeper. During one of his hidden meetings with Artente, he made a promise that only a man drunk on his own authority would make. He swore an oath to give her anything she desired. Anything at all. He probably expected her to ask for something manageable, a country estate, a chest of gold, a title for her father. Something he could hand over without consequence. He did not expect her to reach for the one object that would detonate his household from the inside. Artainte asked for the robe of Queen Amestris. Not just any garment. This was a robe that Amestris had woven with her own hands. In a royal world where everything was produced by armies of servants and artisans, a piece of clothing made personally by the queen carried immense symbolic weight. It was intimate. It was sacred. It was proof that she was not merely decorative. She was the central woman of the empire, the one whose hands shaped something no servant could replicate. Xerxes went cold. Handing that robe to his brother's daughter, his secret lover, was not just an insult. It was a detonation device aimed at his own marriage. He begged Artainte to choose something else. He offered her entire cities. He offered her vaults of treasure. She would not budge. She reminded him of his oath. The King of Kings had given his sacred word. Was he going to shatter that over a piece of cloth? And in that moment, Xerxes made the choice that reveals exactly who he was. He cared more about preserving the illusion that his word was unbreakable than he cared about his queen's dignity, his family's stability, or the safety of the woman he claimed to desire. He took the robe from Amestris. History does not record what excuse he gave her. Maybe he invented a ceremony. Maybe he said nothing at all. It did not matter. The robe left the queen's possession and landed on the shoulders of Artainte. The next time the royal court assembled in public, Amestris saw it. Picture that room. A formal occasion, the empire's elite packed into a gilded hall, guards lining the walls, servants standing motionless. And there, among the women, stood Artainte, wearing the queen's own hand-woven robe. Not quietly, not tucked beneath a shawl, proudly, visibly, like a flag planted on conquered territory. Every suspicion Amestris had ever held caught fire in that single moment. This was not a misunderstanding. This was war declared in silk. She did not flinch. She did not lash out. She did not give the court the satisfaction of watching her break. That is not how someone like Amestris operated. She went still. She observed. She memorized every detail. She let the moment pass with perfect composure so that no one could accuse her of losing control. But behind that silence, a decision had already been carved in stone. Someone was going to answer for this, not with a quick exile, not with a clean death, with something that would make the entire empire remember what it cost to humiliate the queen. From that day forward, Amestris waited for one specific opening. In Persian royal tradition, the king's birthday carried a unique and binding power. On that day, the king was expected to grant extraordinary favors. Oaths sworn on the birthday were treated as sacred. Denying a request from a figure of high rank on that occasion was seen as a violation of divine custom. That birthday was Amestris's weapon. She could make a demand so horrific that Xerxes would be trapped between his public identity as a generous, God-appointed ruler and the monstrous reality of what she was asking him to do. As the day approached, the palace hummed with its usual excitement. Courtiers rehearsed their petitions. Provincial governors planned their asks. Xerxes prepared to play the role he loved most, the magnanimous sovereign dispensing favors like a god among mortals, a performance designed to make everyone forget the insecure, scandal-soaked man underneath. He had no idea that his wife had been counting down to this exact day. sharpening her request like a blade. Before we step into that banquet hall and watch what Amestris does with her moment, stop for a second. If you have stayed with this story to this point, you are not a casual viewer. You are one of the rare people who actually wants the full, uncut version of what happened behind palace walls, not the sanitized paragraph in a textbook. I want to invite you to join the lineage, our channel's inner circle. It is the membership that makes investigations like this one possible. When you join, you are not just supporting a channel. You are becoming part of the small group that helps choose which buried chapters of history get dragged into the light next, and you get access to early releases before anyone else sees them. If you feel like you belong here, if you are the kind of person who needs to know what really happened, consider joining the lineage. Right now, link is below the video. Because what is about to happen in that banquet hall changes everything. The room will be full. Wine will be flowing. Xerxes will sit elevated above the crowd, ready to play the generous god-king one more time. And then Amestris will rise. She will smile, and she will ask for a gift that will drag an innocent woman out of safety and into a nightmare of blades and blood. The hall will go silent. The sacred law of the birthday oath will close around Xerxes like a trap. And with a single answer, the King of Kings will hand a living human being over to be destroyed. The king's birthday was meant to be the most celebrated day in the empire. Before the sun had fully risen, the palace erupted into motion. Servants swept through hallways carrying silver trays, freshly lit incense, and polished bronze mirrors. Musicians tested strings and tuned drums. Guards inspected their armor, then inspected it again. Everyone understood the ancient rule attached to this occasion. On this day, Xerxes would hold open court and distribute favors like a god scattering blessings over the mortal world. Pardons, promotions, land grants, titles. Oaths spoken in that room on that day were considered almost holy. If the king agreed to something publicly during the birthday ceremony, reversing it later would not just be embarrassing, it would be blasphemy. Xerxes loved this tradition. It was the one day each year where he could pretend Greece had never happened. He could sit on his elevated platform and perform generosity, power, adoration. Petitioners would line up and kneel. Some begged for estates. Some pleaded for mercy on condemned relatives. Governors requested tax relief or military commands. The whole event was a choreographed exhibition of royal mercy. But this year, hidden inside the crowd of hopeful petitioners, there was someone who had not come to ask. She had come to take. When the ceremony began, Xerxes appeared in full regalia. The hall overflowed with nobles, military commanders, and members of the extended royal family. The air was thick with roasted meat, heavy perfume, and warm wine. On a raised platform draped in silk, the king took his seat. Beside him stood his closest relatives, including Amestris. To anyone watching from the edges of the room, it looked like a portrait of dynastic strength, the royal couple standing together, projecting unity. Only a handful of people in that hall could read the storm locked behind their composed expressions. Petitioners approached one by one. Xerxes granted requests with rehearsed ease, playing the magnanimous sovereign to perfection. Laughter rippled through the crowd at intervals. Cups were raised. But underneath all of that pageantry, a line was quietly advancing toward the moment that would crack the dynasty in half. And then, Amestris rose. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. She stepped forward with the measured control expected of the highest-ranking woman in the empire. She began by praising Xerxes publicly. She spoke about his wisdom, his strength, his role as guardian of the empire. Every word sounded like devotion. Every sentence was perfectly calibrated to sound like loyalty. Nobody in that hall could have guessed that each respectful phrase was just the silk wrapping around something lethal. And then she made her request. She did not ask for gold. She did not ask for territory. She did not ask for jewels or titles. She asked Xerxes to hand over the wife of Masistes. The room turned to stone. This was not a routine favor. Amestris had chosen every word with surgical precision. On the surface, it could be framed as an ordinary request, a queen asking for a woman of the court to be placed under her authority, perhaps as a personal attendant. But every person in that hall who had heard the rumors circulating through the palace understood exactly what was happening. She was claiming the woman she believed had engineered her humiliation. She was demanding the mother of the girl who now wore her robe. Xerxes saw the trap instantly. If he refused his queen on the birthday, in front of the entire court, he would shatter the very tradition that gave him his image of divine generosity. He would look like a fraud, a man who preached unlimited power but flinched when it actually mattered. If he agreed, he would be delivering his own brother's wife into the hands of a woman whose fury he himself had created. He paused, but not for long. His pride made the decision before his mind could catch up. He said yes. The word moved through the hall like a tremor through rock. Servants kept their eyes on the floor. Nobles stared forward, as if they had suddenly gone deaf. Masistes was not present for that exact moment, but the men loyal to him were. They watched. They understood. And they knew that what had just happened could not be undone. This was the king's word, spoken publicly, sealed by the sacred weight of the birthday oath. It was heavier than any chain ever forged. While the celebration continued on the surface, music playing, wine pouring, laughter performing its function, a different set of orders moved through the palace interior. Guards were dispatched to collect Masistes' wife. She was taken from her private quarters, pulled from the only space in the entire palace she might have considered safe. We do not know exactly what she said when the soldiers appeared. Maybe she protested. Maybe she thought it was temporary, some bureaucratic reassignment. Whatever she believed in that moment, it ended the same way. She was separated from anyone who might have defended her and delivered directly into Amestris' control. The queen did not order a swift execution. That would have been merciful, and mercy was not the point. There were a dozen quiet ways to eliminate a rival in an ancient court. Poison slipped into food, a convenient fall, a sudden fever nobody questioned. Amestris wanted none of that. She did not want this woman to simply disappear. She wanted her to be unmade. Herodotus tells us what happened next. And even across thousands of years, the account stops you cold. Amestris had the woman restrained and then ordered her mutilated piece by piece. Her breasts, her nose, her ears, her lips, her tongue, all cut away. Every part of her body that carried identity, that allowed speech, that signaled femininity or status, was removed. And those pieces were not buried or discarded with any dignity. Amestris had them thrown to the royal dogs, fed to animals while the woman who once carried herself with more composure than anyone in the palace still breathed. Think about what that meant in a court where appearance and voice were everything. A noblewoman's face was her shield. Her speech was her influence. Her posture was her survival tool. Amestris did not just inflict suffering. She surgically erased the instruments of personhood. She turned a living woman into something the court could no longer engage with as human. a figure to be stared at, pitied, feared, but never spoken to as an equal again. We are not going to linger on the physical horror. The historical record speaks clearly enough. What matters is what Amestris was building with this act. A message, addressed to every woman in the palace, to every man who might consider using his family as a weapon against the queen, to every person who thought they could touch what belonged to her and walk away whole. The message was not exile. It was not a quiet strangling. It was reconstruction, a human body rebuilt as a living monument to the cost of crossing Amestris. While this was happening behind sealed doors, Xerxes tried to manage the destruction he had set in motion. He knew what his wife was capable of. He understood that handing her Masistes' wife was not a simple court transaction. It was lighting a fire inside his own dynasty. Perhaps he convinced himself he could contain the damage afterward. Perhaps guilt finally started gnawing through his ego. He summoned Masistes. In a separate room, away from the screaming, the two brothers spoke. Xerxes made what he apparently believed was a reasonable proposal. He told Masistes to divorce his wife. As compensation, Xerxes offered him one of his own royal daughters as a replacement. Let that settle for a moment. The same man who had taken Masistes' daughter as his secret lover was now offering a different daughter as a consolation prize. As though women were interchangeable currency, he could shuffle around to cover his debts. Masistes refused. At that point, he still had no idea what had already been done to his wife. All he knew was that the king was pressuring him to abandon her. He would not do it. Herodotus records that Masistes answered firmly, that he declared his loyalty to his wife without hesitation, that he listed her virtues and the years they had built together. He defended her with conviction and force. He did not know that the woman he was defending had already been taken apart, under the queen's orders, piece by piece, in a room not far from where he stood. Xerxes was furious. Being refused twice by members of the same household was more than his ego could absorb. But even in his rage, he did not strike Masistes down in that moment. The conversation ended. Masistes left, still believing that his refusal had been enough, that loyalty and blood were still worth something in this empire. He walked back toward his household, expecting to find the wife he had just passionately defended. What he found instead broke the world he understood. The woman waiting for him was no longer recognizable. The face he had known for years was gone. The voice that had spoken beside him through decades of marriage was gone. The body that had shared his life had been turned into wreckage by the queen's cruelty and the king's cowardice. Everything Masistes believed about the limits of royal power, about the meaning of family loyalty, about the safety of being the king's own brother, all of it collapsed in that single moment of recognition. Something shifted inside him permanently. Masistes gathered his sons. He had deep connections in the eastern provinces, particularly in Bactria, where he commanded real loyalty and had the influence to raise men. If he could reach that territory, he could potentially build a force capable of challenging Xerxes, or at the very least, carve out a space beyond the throne's immediate reach. It was desperate. It was thin. But staying in the palace meant waiting to be destroyed on the king's next whim. And Masistes was done waiting. He prepared to leave. This was not a quiet family departure. A brother of the king riding east with his sons and his household guard carried only one possible meaning. The bonds of trust had been severed completely. The court read it instantly. Masistes was heading toward open rebellion. The same empire that had once marched as a unified colossus into Greece was now fracturing from within, Because one man could not control his appetite, and one woman would not let a humiliation go unanswered. Word of Masistes' movement reached Xerxes almost immediately. The same network of informants that had fed palace gossip to the queen now delivered military intelligence to the king. A man like Masistes could not disappear quietly. Scouts tracked his route. The direction was unmistakable: east toward Bactria and the armies that waited there. For Xerxes, this was no longer a family dispute. It was an existential threat. If his brother reached allied territory and raised a banner, other discontented nobles could rally to his cause. Greece had already proved the empire was not invincible. A civil war on top of that humiliation could end the dynasty entirely. So Xerxes made the final decision. He sent soldiers to hunt down Masistes and kill him. Not just him, his sons as well. Every male who carried the potential to become a rival dynasty, a symbol of betrayal, or a rallying point for rebellion. The man who had turned human relationships into possessions inside his private chambers now turned his own bloodline into targets on an open road. And the killers he dispatched were not ordinary troops. He sent the Immortals, Persia's most feared elite soldiers. Before we follow those hunters into the dust and heat of the eastern roads, let me pause for a moment. You are watching a story built from dense, serious historical sources that most people never encounter directly. For this episode, we anchored the narrative in one monumental work of scholarship on the Achaemenid Empire and the inner world of Xerxes' court. That book, the foundation behind everything you have heard today, is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. It is not casual reading. It is a deep, unrelenting archive of power, cruelty, and political machinery. But if you want to understand how this civilization actually functioned beyond the simplified version you were taught in school, it belongs on your shelf, and there is more waiting behind that button. Alongside that central volume, we have assembled a curated collection of relics and themed objects connected to this era. I will not spoil what is inside because the selection rotates, but think of it as a personal cabinet of dark history. Immersive pieces and memorabilia waiting to be explored. You will also find our official Ancestral collection there. Essential dark history books you should own. If you are the kind of person who watches videos like this all the way through, that collection was made specifically for you. Open the shelf, browse the titles and artifacts, and take your time while I finish this story. Because where we go next is open ground. Masistes and his sons are riding hard toward the east, chasing the fragile hope that distance can buy them safety. Behind them, the dust is already rising. The Immortals are closing the gap with every passing hour, carrying a direct order from the king to erase an entire branch of his own family from existence. Back in the palace, the mutilated body of Masistes' wife remains, a silent monument to everything that started this chain of destruction. Out on that road, there will be no gold-plated walls, no courtly protocol, no more carefully chosen words, only iron, sand, and the final bloody answer to the question that has been building since the beginning. How far will Xerxes go to protect his throne from the people who share his own blood? The Immortals moved like a machine with a single purpose. Their role in the empire had always been simple to explain and terrifying to witness. They were the blade the king pointed at problems he wanted erased. When one soldier fell, another filled the gap instantly, so the unit never shrank. Now that blade, sharpened and disciplined, was not aimed at a foreign army. It was aimed at a royal caravan fleeing east through the dust. Masistes and his sons drove their horses hard. They knew this terrain better than most men who had spent their lives inside palace walls. The road to Bactria was brutal. Dry plains that cracked under hooves, stony ridges that slowed wagons, air so thick with dust it burned the lungs. Behind them, the empire stretched like a shadow with teeth. Masistes was no romantic dreamer chasing a fantasy. He was a veteran, a man who had counseled kings and led soldiers. If he believed Bactria held allies willing to stand with him, it was because he had spent years building those connections. But none of that mattered if the immortals caught him first. They closed the distance with mechanical patience. No wild charge, no reckless sprint. They marched at a calculated rhythm, resting just enough to stay lethal. Scouts rode ahead, reading hoof prints and wagon ruts in the dry earth. There was no mystery about where Masistes was heading. A brother of the king could not vanish like a common fugitive. His flight was a wound cut into the surface of the empire, visible to everyone. Somewhere along that road, near a narrow pass or a cluster of low buildings baked white by the sun, the two groups finally collided. There was no parley, no offer of surrender, no attempt to drag Masistes back in chains for a public trial. The orders left no room for interpretation. End the threat. In the violence that followed, there was steel, shouting, and clouds of kicked-up earth. Masistes and his sons were outnumbered and overwhelmed. They died far from the gilded corridors where all of this had started. One more branch of the royal bloodline ended not in marble splendor, but in roadside dirt. The report traveled back to Xerxes, written in the flat, formal language of military dispatches. The king had issued a command. The command had been executed. In bureaucratic terms, the system had functioned. A potential rebellion had been crushed before it could breathe. The bodies were left where they fell or buried without ceremony. No shrine, no mourning. The matter could have been sealed shut right there, filed away as one more necessary act of imperial order. But empires do not process information the way official reports suggest. News traveled on two tracks, through sealed dispatches and through the mouths of terrified servants. People inside the court did not know every detail, but they knew the shape of what had happened. They knew the king had allowed his queen to destroy his brother's wife. They knew he had then sent the immortals to slaughter that same brother and his sons. And they knew it had all started with an affair behind closed doors and a stolen robe draped over a girl's shoulders. The effect on the Persian elite was like venom entering the bloodstream slowly. Many of them had absorbed the mutilation of Masistes' wife as a contained act of royal cruelty, something savage, but limited to the private world of the harem. Sending the empire's most feared soldiers to annihilate a loyal brother's entire male line over a domestic catastrophe was something else entirely. It proved that the king's destruction did not stay behind bedroom walls. It extended into the open to armored men on horseback. If Xerxes could do this to his own blood, no one in the empire was beyond his reach. One man who absorbed every detail of this unraveling was Artabanus. He was not a minor court figure. He held serious rank. Most sources describe him as a powerful official and military commander embedded deep inside the palace's security apparatus. In some traditions, he is the same Artabanus who had once cautioned against the reckless invasion of Greece. Whether every historical thread connecting him is perfectly accurate, the portrait is consistent. This was a man who understood how power worked and where it failed. He watched the king spiral. He saw a ruler who had been broken by Greece, who had drowned himself in private obsession, who had let his queen convert the palace into a theater of mutilation, and who had then solved the mess by exterminating his own brother's household. That was not the behavior of a strong monarch. That was instability wearing a crown. For a man whose entire role was protecting the monarchy, the logic became harder and harder to escape. The biggest threat to the throne was no longer outside the walls. It was sitting on the throne itself. And this is where the horror changed direction. Until now, all the violence had flowed downward, from king and queen onto the people beneath them. Now, a blade began rising upward, pointed at the man the entire empire called the God King. Artabanus did not move alone. An assassination inside the most heavily guarded building on Earth required more than one pair of hands. He reached out to a tight circle of men, officers, palace insiders, people who shared his conviction that Xerxes was dragging the empire toward a collapse that no military campaign could reverse. The plan they assembled was as cold and deliberate as anything Amestris had ever orchestrated. Xerxes had one glaring weakness. He believed he was untouchable inside his own rooms. He slept surrounded by men he trusted, not strangers. Artabanus's position gave him legitimate access to those inner spaces. If he turned that access into a weapon, he could reach a place no foreign army had ever penetrated: the royal bed itself. One night, the conspirators moved. The palace at night was quieter than the day, but never truly still. Torches guttered low in their brackets. Guards stood at their positions. Slaves slept folded against walls. Artabanus and his chosen men passed through these corridors under the cover of their own authority. They were not intruders. They belonged. And that was precisely what made them lethal. The people who already carry the keys are always the ones who can open the doors that should stay locked. They reached Xerxes' chamber. The king who had ordered mutilations with a sentence and executions with a nod now lay in the most vulnerable state any human can occupy. Asleep, unarmed, trusting the architecture of loyalty around him to hold. The exact sequence of what happened next is blurred by centuries. Some accounts say Artabanus delivered the killing blow himself. Others say he used a servant or a guard. The details shift, but the core does not. The king, who had transformed his palace into a private slaughterhouse, died inside that palace, killed by the hands of men who had once knelt before him. No trumpet sounded. No army clashed in the field. The King of Kings ended in a quiet room, in the dark, under the hands of his own protectors. For a brief window, hours, maybe days, the center of the empire was hollow, and only a handful of people knew. That gap was Artabanus's opportunity. He moved fast to convert the killing into a seizure of power. The next move was even more calculated. Xerxes had sons. The natural heir was Darius, the eldest. A younger son, Artaxerxes, stood further back in the line. Artabanus understood that if Darius took the throne immediately, the first thing he would order was an investigation. And that investigation would lead straight back to the men who had blood on their hands. So Artabanus decided to sever the next link before it could form. He went to Artaxerxes. In some versions, he told the young prince that Darius had murdered their father. He painted a portrait of a power-hungry older brother who had killed the king to seize the crown for himself. Artaxerxes, shattered by grief and still reeling, believed him. He was young. His entire world was the palace. The commander standing in front of him had always been presented as a pillar of loyalty and discipline. Why would a man like that fabricate something so monstrous? Under that manipulation, Artaxerxes turned against his own brother. The palace, already saturated in blood, absorbed another royal killing. Darius, the legitimate heir by traditional succession, was cut down before he could claim what was his. With Xerxes dead in his chamber, and Darius dead beside him in the sequence of violence, a path opened for Artaxerxes to ascend. Guided at every step by the man who had engineered the entire chain. For a brief period, Artabanus operated as if the empire rested in his palm. He had eliminated the old king and neutralized the primary heir. He had a grieving young prince beside him, who owed his survival and his crown to the captain's intervention. On paper, Artabanus held supreme influence. Behind the throne, he could shape policy, command the guard, and decide who lived or died within the palace. He had converted his fear of Xerxes' instability into an aggressive seizure of control. But there was one mind he had failed to account for. Queen Amestris had lost her husband and one of her sons. She was not finished. She had already demonstrated that she possessed an intelligence built for exactly this kind of environment: brutal, patient, surgical. She understood how information flowed through the palace better than almost anyone alive. Her title had changed, but her instincts had not. She listened. She measured silences. She watched who seemed restless, who spoke too eagerly, who changed the subject when certain names were mentioned. Slowly, a pattern emerged from the noise. Amestris understood that the deaths of Xerxes and Darius were not separate tragedies. They were connected. She grasped that Artaxerxes had been deceived, and that Artabanus, the man everyone trusted to protect the throne, sat at the center of the web. In that realization, her survival and her son's survival aligned perfectly with the interests of the dynasty. She might have been a source of terror inside the palace for years, but she was also the fiercest defender of her own blood. A captain who could murder one king and frame an heir could do it again whenever it served him. So, she moved. Carefully, she reached Artaxerxes. Maybe through a private audience, maybe through advisors whose loyalty to her had never wavered. However she did it, she delivered the truth, or enough of it, into his ears. She reminded him who stood to gain from both deaths. She reminded him that Artabanus had been near the king's chambers the night he died. She traced the obvious trail that shock and grief had hidden from him. Artaxerxes was young, but he was not permanently blind. His father dead in secret, his brother killed on the testimony of a single man. That same man now standing permanently at his side, too comfortable in the chaos, too prepared with answers. Once doubt took root, it grew rapidly. The prince's grief hardened into fury. Together, mother and son designed a counterstrike. They chose the throne room for the confrontation. The seat of royal authority would become the stage for reckoning. Artabanus walked into that hall, believing he still controlled the narrative. He likely expected another day of quiet influence, another session of guiding the king he had manufactured. What he stepped into was an ambush. In front of the assembled court, the atmosphere shifted. Accusations were raised. The story Artabanus had constructed began to fracture under direct questioning. Maybe he denied everything. Maybe he tried to redirect blame. It did not matter. The royal guard, whose allegiance had been quietly realigned by Amestris and her son, no longer answered to him. They were waiting for a signal from the throne, not from the captain. The signal came. In an instant, the man who had ordered killings from the shadows found himself on the other side of the blade. Artabanus was seized. His allies, caught unprepared, were dragged down with him. The same machinery that had once obeyed his commands now turned to grind him out of existence. In the purge that followed, Artabanus and his male relatives were executed. The man who had dared to carve up the royal succession was himself carved out of it. The message resonated through every corridor of the palace. There could be one source of terror under that roof, not two. Amestris had lost her husband and a son, but she had preserved another son and secured his throne. She emerged from the wreckage not as a powerless widow grieving in seclusion, but as the queen mother standing behind a new king, Artaxerxes I. When you pull back and look at the full arc, the pattern is devastating. Xerxes turned human beings into objects of pleasure inside his private world. Amestris turned human bodies into instruments of warning. The destruction of Masistes' wife and the extermination of his sons turned the royal household into an engine of fear, where people were dismantled or discarded to feed the insecurities of whoever sat highest. That behavior did not stay contained within the palace walls. It infected the entire system. Artabanus absorbed the lesson and replicated it, using covert violence to rearrange the line of kings. And then Amestris turned that same weapon back on him. By the time the dust finally settled, nearly everyone who had ignited this catastrophe was gone. Masistes lay dead on an eastern road. His sons lay dead beside him. His wife survived or perished under wounds that made her unrecognizable, depending on which account you follow. But either way, the life she had known was finished. Xerxes rested in a tomb, killed not by the Greek soldiers who had humiliated him at sea, but by the men sworn to guard him while he slept. Darius, the eldest son, was erased by a brother acting on poisoned information. Artabanus and his entire clan fell under the sword inside the palace he had once commanded. Who remained standing? Amestris, still feared, still unpunished, still projecting power from behind her son's throne. Greek historians would later hold her up as the embodiment of Persian cruelty, the nightmare queen who carved women apart and fed on the suffering of her enemies. They painted her as the monster lurking behind the curtain. On one level, that framing is propaganda. Greek writers had every incentive to portray Persia as a land of depravity and excess. But on another level, even accounting for exaggeration, they did not invent the foundation of the story. Something like this happened. A woman was surrendered to a queen and dismembered. A brother was hunted across the empire. A king was killed in his own bed. That is why this story demands to be told. It reveals what happens when power operates without any restraint, when a king treats every desire as a divine command, when a queen believes every slight must be repaid in blood, when the men entrusted with defending the throne decide the only way to save the empire is to murder the man who rules it. The Persian Empire did not collapse in a single night because of this affair, but it decayed a little further from within. An empire that consumes its own family like meat will not hold together forever. And if you pull back even further, past the palace gates, past the desert roads, past the centuries, you see a pattern that repeats across every civilization that has ever concentrated too much power in too few hands. The instruments of terror that rulers build to control others almost always end up being turned against them. Xerxes and Amestris tried to dominate their world by reducing people to objects, ornaments, or warnings. In the end, the blade reversed, and the palace they ruled became the place where they were betrayed, widowed, and buried. The final image to carry with you is this: the halls of Susa, quiet after the storm, the air still heavy with the memory of screams and whispered conspiracies, the throne now occupied by Artaxerxes, young but permanently scarred by the blood of his father and his brother. Standing near him, Amestris, the queen mother, alive when nearly everyone else is dead. The mutilated, the executed, the betrayed, none of them have a voice anymore. She does. In this court, survival is the only proof of power that matters. And she holds it. Generations later, when Greek writers search for an example to illustrate the darkness hiding inside Persian luxury, they reach for her. They tell the story of an unnamed wife dismembered and fed to dogs, of a royal brother hunted down on an open road, of a god king murdered in his sleep. They want to horrify their readers. They succeed. Because the story is not a myth, it is a record of what unfolds when lust, pride, and cruelty govern a house that controls the fate of millions. If you have stayed with me to this final moment, you belong to a very small group of people. The ones who can sit with the full weight of stories like this without turning away. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more deep investigations into the darkest corners of real history, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who still thinks ancient empires were nothing but marble columns and heroic battles. They need to see what the inside of the palace actually looked like. On your screen right now, there is another video waiting, handpicked as the next step on this journey into the past. Click it. Keep going. If you made it through this story, the next one was chosen for you. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history destination on YouTube.